The house felt emptier than ever. The laughter that once filled the rooms had faded into a hollow silence, only broken by the occasional clink of dishes or the hum of the television in the background. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the family photo that hung on the wall, the picture of the perfect family, now a ghost of what it used to be. His wife, Sarah, was no longer there, having passed away just 6 months ago, but the absence still weighed heavily on him and their son, Liam. Liam had changed. It wasn't the subtle shifts that happen in adolescence, those were expected. It was something deeper, something darker. The boy who used to come home from school with a smile, eager to tell his dad about his day, had become withdrawn, barely speaking except when absolutely necessary. He had stopped playing basketball in the driveway, stopped hanging out with his friends, and worse, he'd begun skipping school altogether. Daniel had hoped that the time would heal the rift between them, but instead, it felt like every day that passed, they grew further apart. It was Thursday evening when Daniel finally confronted Liam about his school absences. He had waited for the right moment, but the boy had been distant and nonchalant, as if he didn't care anymore. "Liam, we need to talk," Daniel began, his voice trying to sound firm but his heart sinking with every word. He stood in the doorway of Liam's room, watching as his son scrolled mindlessly through his phone, his face a mask of indifference. "About what?" Liam mumbled, not even looking up. "About school," Daniel said, stepping into the room and sitting on the edge of the bed. "I saw your grades, and I noticed you haven't been going lately. You're barely even leaving your room anymore. I'm worried about you." Liam scoffed, finally glancing up from his phone. "I'm fine," he muttered, the edge of his voice betraying his frustration. "You don't get it?" The words hit Daniel like a slap in the face. "I don't get it," he repeated, disbelief mixing with hurt. "Liam, you're my son. I'm just trying to help. You're shutting me out, and I don't know what to do." Liam didn't answer, his gaze dropping back to the phone screen as if the conversation was already over. Daniel's frustration boiled over. He stood up, pacing the small room, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of helplessness. "I lost your mom, Liam," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And now I'm losing you too. You think I don't get it? I'm trying to hold everything together, but it's hard when you won't talk to me." There was a long silence before Liam spoke again, this time his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to talk to you. I don't know how to talk to anyone." The words were small, fragile, like they had been trapped in his chest for weeks, maybe longer. Daniel froze, his heart aching. He had always tried to be the strong one, the one who would keep it all together for both of them. But here was his son, broken, and Daniel had no idea how to fix it. "I'm here, Liam," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm always here for you. But I can't help if you don't let me in." Liam didn't respond, but for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt like there might still be a chance, like the gulf between them wasn't too wide to cross. As Daniel left the room, he didn't know how they would fix things. But for the first time, he realized that he had to be patient. He couldn't force Liam to heal. But he could try to be the father his son needed, even if he didn't know exactly how to do that. Later that night, as Daniel lay in bed, his thoughts swirled. He couldn't shake the feeling that Liam's behavior was more than just a typical teenage phase. Something deeper was at play, something that neither of them had been able to face. But maybe, just maybe, this small crack in Liam's wall was the beginning of something that could help them both heal. Daniel couldn't fix Liam's pain overnight, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to give up on him. The morning came too quickly. Daniel had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the conversation he had with Liam the night before. It had been a breakthrough, but at what cost? He knew that opening the door to Liam's pain would require patience, but he also understood that it wasn't going to be easy. He had spent the last few months grieving his wife's death, and now he had to help his son grieve too. But how? The morning was cold, a sharp contrast to the warm memories Daniel had of earlier years when their family would all gather around the kitchen table for pancakes and laughter. It had been a simple tradition, Saturday mornings spent together before the world took them in different directions. Now, it was just Daniel and Liam, and the space between them felt like a chasm too wide to cross. Liam was in the kitchen, eyes glued to his phone as usual, barely acknowledging his father's presence. Daniel had never been the one to force things, but he knew this was a moment he couldn't let slip by. "How about breakfast today?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice light despite the heavy atmosphere that hung between them. Liam didn't look up. "I'm not hungry." Daniel didn't push, though the disappointment in his chest was undeniable. He moved to the stove and began making pancakes anyway, the familiar sizzle of the batter on the pan sounding strangely out of place in the quiet of the morning. As he flipped the pancakes, he could feel Liam's eyes on him. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words. Finally, as Daniel plated the pancakes, Liam spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to talk about it," he muttered. Daniel set the plate down in front of his son, sitting across from him at the table. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Daniel refused to let it win. He knew they needed this moment, even if Liam didn't realize it yet. "You don't have to talk about it right now," Daniel said softly, his voice steady despite the ache inside. "But I want you to know that I'm here for you. I know it's hard, Liam. I know it's not easy to talk about Mom." Liam stiffened, his shoulders going rigid. The word Mom hung in the air between them, a reminder of the hole that had been torn in their lives. He pushed his plate away without touching it, his eyes dark with frustration. "Why do you always bring her up?" Liam snapped, his voice raw, and Daniel could see the battle in his son's eyes. He didn't want to talk about his mother, not yet. Not with the anger and grief that were still so fresh in his heart. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you," Daniel said, his tone gentle, understanding. "I just want you to know that it's okay to feel sad. It's okay to miss her. But it's also okay to feel angry, or confused, or even lost." Liam's gaze softened for a moment, but he quickly averted his eyes, the walls going back up. He wasn't ready to let his guard down, not yet. But Daniel had learned long ago that patience was the key. He had to let Liam come to him when he was ready. The pressure of expectation only made things worse. Daniel sat back in his chair, not forcing the issue. Instead, he let the silence stretch on, the simple act of sharing a meal between them providing a tentative bridge. They didn't need to say anything more, at least not yet. But the fact that they were sitting at the same table, sharing something as ordinary as pancakes, was progress. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. After a few moments, Daniel looked up, watching as Liam stared at his phone again, the distance between them still palpable. But something was different. There was a crack in the barrier, a tiny chink in the armor his son had built around himself. And for the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could start to heal. Liam's phone buzzed with a notification, and he glanced at it before locking it again. Daniel caught the brief flicker of something in his son's eyes, an emotion he couldn't quite place. "You know," Daniel said, breaking the silence, "we could spend the day together. Go out, maybe. Go fishing, just like we used to. What do you think?" Liam looked up, his expression unreadable. "Fishing," he repeated, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "Yeah," Daniel said, feeling a spark of hope. "I thought we could go to that lake near the park. I remember how much you used to love it. Just us. No distractions." Liam didn't respond immediately, but the slightest shift in his posture told Daniel that he wasn't completely closed off to the idea. Maybe it wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a start, a chance for them to reconnect in a way that was less about words and more about shared experiences. "I'll think about it," Liam finally said, his voice quieter now, softer. Daniel nodded, a small but hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "That's all I ask." As they finished breakfast in silence, Daniel felt the weight of the situation but also a small, hopeful glimmer. Liam wasn't ready to talk, and Daniel wasn't going to push him. But he was here, present, and ready whenever Liam was ready to share. In that moment, it was enough. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the start of something better. The day stretched on with an uncomfortable silence hanging over the house. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on Daniel's chest as he went about his day, trying to keep his mind distracted from the brewing tension between him and Liam. The breakfast was a fleeting moment of connection, but the walls had quickly built back up, just like before. Liam had agreed to the fishing trip, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was more out of obligation than desire. He had seen the hesitation in his son's eyes, the unwillingness to truly open up. But Daniel had learned that sometimes, progress didn't come in big moments, it came in small, gradual steps. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Daniel prepared for the trip. The lake was only a short drive away, but the anticipation of what lay ahead felt much longer. He had planned this carefully, not wanting to make it another forced attempt at reconciliation. No lectures, no pressure, just an opportunity for Liam to talk, if he wanted to. Or not. Liam had barely spoken since breakfast. He'd gone to his room after, locking the door behind him, and Daniel hadn't pressed. He had tried to call out to him once or twice, but his son's silence had been the answer. They left the house just as the evening sky began to blush with the colors of twilight. The car ride was filled with a tense quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional soft shuffle of Liam in the passenger seat. Daniel stole glances at his son, but every time he did, Liam was either staring out the window or glued to his phone, his face hidden in the dim light. It was as if he were trying to disappear into the darkness, away from the reality of the moment. "Liam," Daniel said, his voice low but steady, "you don't have to talk, but I want you to know that I'm here. No matter what." Liam's response was a slight shift in his seat, but it was enough. Daniel wasn't expecting a breakthrough. He knew that the journey wasn't going to be quick, nor would it be linear. It would be a slow unraveling of the pain and grief that Liam was carrying with him. The lake came into view, its surface glimmering faintly under the fading light of the day. Daniel parked the car and got out, but Liam stayed inside, unmoving. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, looking at the lake, the deep blue water reflecting the dimming sky. This was supposed to be their place, a place where they had shared so many quiet moments in the past. He wasn't sure if it was still theirs anymore, not with all the hurt that had been piled between them. He took a breath and walked back to the car, opening the passenger door. "Come on, Liam. Let's get some air," he urged gently. Liam didn't look up, but after a few seconds, he grudgingly unbuckled his seatbelt and followed Daniel to the edge of the lake. The ground was soft underfoot, and the air smelled fresh, a sharp contrast to the heaviness of the conversation that loomed. They didn't speak at first, just stood there side by side, staring out over the water. The evening chill settled in around them as Daniel set up the fishing rods. He didn't try to rush it. Instead, he worked in silence, each movement deliberate, giving Liam the space he needed. They had done this countless times before, this simple act of fishing. It wasn't about the fish. It was about the time spent together, the quiet moments where words weren't necessary. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Liam spoke. "I don't want to talk about her," he muttered, his voice barely audible against the rustling of the trees. Daniel's heart clenched, but he stayed calm. "I know, son. You don't have to talk about her." Liam's eyes darted to his father, searching for something in his face. For a second, Daniel thought Liam was going to push him away again, but instead, his son's shoulders sagged, the tension beginning to release. I don't know how to deal with it," Liam whispered, his voice cracking just enough for Daniel to hear. Daniel's grip tightened around the fishing rod, the weight of his son's words sinking deep into his heart. "I know, buddy," he said softly, his voice steady, despite the surge of emotion rising in his chest. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. We'll do it together, okay?" Liam didn't say anything for a long while. The silence hung heavy, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the silence of avoidance, it was the silence of understanding. They were both trying to navigate this unfamiliar, painful reality together. As the night deepened, the conversation continued in small fragments, each word building upon the last. They didn't rush to address the past, nor did they try to make sense of the impossible. They just allowed themselves to be in the moment, two souls trying to find their way back to each other. Eventually, the fish stopped biting, and the night grew colder. Daniel felt a sense of peace settle over him, not because all was resolved, but because they had taken the first real step toward healing. Liam finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "Thanks, Dad. For this. I think I needed it." Daniel smiled, feeling a sense of pride he hadn't known in months. He wasn't sure what the future held, or how long it would take to rebuild their bond, but he was willing to be patient. For the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on the same path. They walked back to the car in silence, but it wasn't the cold, uncomfortable silence it had been before. It was the silence of two people who, despite everything, were beginning to understand each other again. And that, Daniel realized, was all that really mattered. The air was thick with tension as Daniel and Liam returned home, the night's fishing trip still heavy in their minds. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore, it had morphed into something more profound. Liam wasn't avoiding his father's presence, he was just grappling with the weight of everything he'd kept buried inside for so long. The house, once a place of solace, now felt suffocating. The lights in the kitchen flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the walls. Daniel took a deep breath, stepping inside, but Liam lingered at the doorway, eyes scanning the room as if expecting something, anything, to change. "I'm going to my room," Liam said, his voice low but certain. Daniel nodded, a mix of relief and sorrow filling his chest. This was progress, he knew. Even if it was small, even if Liam was still retreating, it was progress. He watched his son disappear down the hallway, then let out a shaky breath. But the night wasn't over yet. As Daniel set about cleaning up from dinner, something caught his attention. A slight noise, a soft click, followed by the faint sound of a drawer being opened. He froze, his body tense, instincts kicking in. The house was quiet again, except for the subtle hum of the refrigerator and the tap of water in the sink. Daniel knew that sound too well. The unmistakable sound of a drawer opening, but not in the way it should have been. It was too quiet. Too deliberate. He stopped what he was doing and turned slowly, eyes scanning the kitchen. It was then that he saw it. The slight movement of a shadow against the hallway wall. Liam wasn't in his room. Daniel's pulse quickened as he took a cautious step forward, then another. He had to be sure. The sound had come from the study, a room that had been off-limits to both of them for months. They hadn't spoken much about the contents of that room, but it was full of memories, things from Liam's mother, things Daniel wasn't ready to face. As he approached the doorway to the study, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. The dim light from the hallway stretched across the floor, casting an eerie glow on the room's contents. His heart hammered in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to turn away, but he couldn't. Not anymore. He nudged the door open with a hesitant hand, the hinges creaking like the room itself was waking up. And then he saw it. Liam, standing by the desk, his back turned. He was rummaging through the drawers, his hands quick and frantic. Liam. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper, yet it sliced through the tension in the air like a knife. Liam jumped, his body rigid, as if caught in the act. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen. Daniel's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to ask what Liam was looking for. He could feel it. Something was off. He knew his son's behavior had been erratic, but this, the desperation in Liam's movements, was something deeper. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked, his voice steady, though the anxiety was rising within him. Liam didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly pulled a small leather-bound journal from the drawer, his fingers trembling as he closed it quickly. His eyes met Daniel's, and for the first time that night, Daniel saw something raw, vulnerable, almost broken. I need to find something," Liam said, his voice unsteady. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about grief anymore. There was something else, something Liam wasn't telling him. "You don't have to hide anything from me, son," Daniel said, his voice soft but firm. "Whatever it is, we can talk about it." Liam's expression flickered, his eyes darting nervously from the journal to Daniel, then back again. It was the look of someone who wasn't ready to face what they were holding inside. "I'm just trying to understand," Liam muttered, almost to himself. "I need to understand." Daniel stepped forward, his heart breaking for the son who had been lost to grief and confusion. But there was more here. Much more. And it was becoming clear that Liam wasn't the only one struggling to make sense of their new reality. Daniel's hand reached out, gently taking the journal from Liam's grasp. His son didn't resist. There was something in that gesture, something fragile, something that spoke of a broken bond still being stitched back together. "Let me help you," Daniel said quietly, his voice full of emotion. He could see the fear in Liam's eyes, the fear of confronting the past, of acknowledging the truth. But Daniel knew this was a moment that couldn't be avoided. They were standing on the edge of something huge, something life-altering. Liam's lip trembled slightly as he finally spoke. "I can't just let go, Dad. I can't forget her. I don't even know who I am anymore without her." Daniel's heart clenched. He wanted to reach out, to pull his son into his arms, but he knew that wasn't what Liam needed right now. Instead, he placed the journal gently on the desk, keeping his hand on it as a symbol of his presence. "You don't have to forget her, Liam," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But you can't keep carrying all of this alone." Liam stayed silent, but the look in his eyes was enough to show that he was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about the grief. It was about finding a way to heal, to rebuild. The journal between them became a symbol, not just of the past they both wished they could escape, but of the future they could still create. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be real. Daniel knew that tonight, for the first time in a long while, they were beginning to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Liam didn't speak, but the way he nodded, just slightly, told Daniel everything he needed to know. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was just one more step, one more moment on the long road ahead. But for the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting its early morning glow over the small town, but Daniel was already awake, his mind racing. He had barely slept the night before, consumed by thoughts of Liam, the journal, and the weight of the conversation they'd had. But in the quiet of the morning, he found a strange sense of peace, a sense that he hadn't had in months. Liam was still asleep, and Daniel had a moment to reflect on the events of the past few days. The anger, the confusion, the silence, they all felt like they belonged to another life. It was as if a door had opened, a crack just wide enough for them to start stepping through together. But Daniel knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There was still so much more to face. As he made his way downstairs, he heard the soft murmur of Liam's voice coming from the living room. Daniel froze for a moment, wondering what his son was doing up so early. But then, he realized that it wasn't the time for hesitation. He had to move forward. They both did. He walked into the living room to find Liam sitting on the couch, the journal resting on his lap. His son looked up at him as he entered, his eyes still heavy with the remnants of sleep but clear with something more, something that wasn't there before. "I read some more," Liam said quietly, his voice steady. I think I understand now." Daniel sat down beside him, his heart swelling. He hadn't heard those words in so long, Words that hinted at healing, at hope. For the first time, Daniel realized that Liam wasn't just grieving his mother's loss. He had been struggling to find a way forward, caught in a storm of emotions he didn't know how to navigate. And now, it seemed, they were finally beginning to find their way out. "You're not alone, son," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You never were?" Liam nodded, his hand gripping the journal tightly. It was clear that it was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a bridge to something new. Something they could build together. But before Daniel could say anything more, Liam spoke again, his voice trembling with a mix of vulnerability and resolve. "Dad, I don't know what to do now. I don't know how to make it all stop hurting." Daniel's throat tightened. He wished he had an answer, something that would make the pain go away, something that would fix everything. But the truth was, there was no quick fix. There was no magic solution. They had to face this together, step by step. "There's no easy way out, Liam," Daniel said, his voice firm but gentle. "But we're going to take it one day at a time. We'll figure it out, together." Liam looked at his father, a tear slipping down his cheek, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel the need to fix everything. He didn't need to rush the healing process. He just needed to be there. To listen. To give his son the space he needed to grieve and to grow. In that moment, Daniel realized that their relationship was changing, but not in the way he had expected. It wasn't about fixing everything that had been broken. It was about understanding that some things could never be undone. But together, they could move forward. They could rebuild. The weight of the journal on his son's lap reminded Daniel that while the past would always be with them, it didn't have to control their future. They had the power to shape their own path. One that was built on trust, on open communication, and on the shared understanding that no matter what had happened, they would always have each other. "Let's go fishing again soon," Daniel said, his voice softer now, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think we've got a lot more to talk about." Liam didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice was filled with something new, something hopeful. "Yeah. I'd like that." And just like that, Daniel knew that their journey together was only just beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments of doubt and pain. But as father and son, they would walk it together. One step at a time. With that, Daniel got to his feet, extending a hand to Liam. A simple gesture, but one that carried a weight of meaning. Liam looked at his father, then took his hand. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the warmth of connection, the promise of healing. And as they stood there together, facing the unknown, Daniel knew that their bond had been strengthened, not by words, but by the understanding that, no matter how broken they had been, they would always have each other. And that was enough. The end was no longer a place of despair. It was the beginning of something new. Something better.